You put out a statement this morning in your name about the fourth report of the joint investigative mechanism that
Right.
was set up to look at alleged chemical weapons
Right.
attacks in Syria. And I'm presuming this came up for discussion at the UN Security Council yesterday, and the Russians said that they were not convinced
That's correct.
of the findings.
That's correct.
I'm going to presume safely, I think, that your statement means that you fully back the findings of the so-called JIM.
Yes, that is a correct assumption to make, that we do support the JIM. We support these types of mechanisms. They're doing important work, really shining a light on these uses of chemical weapons in Syria. And I would note that, the 4 incidents that are noted in the report that took place, the use of chemical weapons that took place in 2014 and 2015, 3 of them were by the Syrian regime. So in that respect, they outdid Daesh in horrific acts on their own people.
Right.
Please.
Isn't accepting those findings the same thing as accepting that the deal that you guys worked out with the Russians to get rid of chemical weapons in Syria didn't work?
Well, again, I think, and we've been very clear about this, the deal that we worked out with and successfully implemented with the Russians was declared chemical weapons. And we recognize that. Please.
Sorry.
Go ahead, that's okay.
You say successfully implemented, but doesn't this finding and your acceptance of it mean that in fact it wasn't successfully implemented if they're still using chemical weapons, whether or not chlorine is a declared?
Well, that's so again, when I say declared chemical weapons, I mean exactly that. So why do I view this as a success, that we were able to eliminate a significant quantity, well, all of their declared chemical weapons, and a significant quantity of chemical weapons? Because clearly the regime has shown that it will use these as a weapon of war against its own people. So the fact that they have far less chemical weapons in their arsenal now than they did previously to this successful action that we took is, I don't want to say a silver lining or a good thing for the Syrian people, but
I don't see how you can say it's a success if you say it was supposed to get rid of all chemical weapons.
no, it was well, I mean, look.
What did you think he had stocks of chlorine for? Obviously there was a lot of it. But I mean, there's in the middle of a civil war, there's only so much industrial use for chlorine, and I don't think there are enough swimming pools there that would need it to. What did you think he was going to do with chlorine? Why wasn't that part of the agreement with the Russians, even if it was, a side deal? You didn't think that with all that chlorine that he's got, it was not going to be used as a weapon, did you?
Well, again, you're right in that we only went after the what were the known chemical weapons arsenal, or as I said, declared chemical weapons arsenal that the Syrian regime had in its possession. We obviously didn't remove all their capacity to create chemical weapons. As you mentioned, the issue of chlorine and chlorine gas as chemical weapons is clearly a concern that they've used this as a weapon and shown that they're capable of doing so. But we significantly reduced their arsenal of chemical weapons. And again, we took away and neutralized all of the other chemical weapons that they possessed. I know it's not a complete victory in this case, but it's a significant one nonetheless, in that they're less able to use these against their own people.
If in fact they got rid of all of their declared chemical weapons, not leaving aside the chlorine issue, where do you believe ISIL got the mustard gas that it used according to this report? Did they produce it themselves, or did they take it from?
It's unclear.
The stocks?
It's unclear how
So
they got it
again,
or where
doesn't,
they got it. Yeah.
okay, but if they got it from the Syrian government stockpile, if they stole it from there, that would also mean that it wasn't a success, right?
So
That the deal was not a success because it clearly didn't get rid of all the declared stuff. I mean, mustard gas is that's a declared
yes, it
thing.
is a chemical weapon. Yes, it is a declared or a recognized chemical weapon. I mean, look, we eliminated through this program about 1,200 tons of chemical weapons that was in the possession of the Syrian regime. To the best of our knowledge, we eliminated all of their declared chemical weapons. But we recognize that that didn't include chlorine. And as far as mustard gas goes, we don't know how they were able to either make it or get a hold of that. We just don't have a clear visibility on that. But what's important is that this mechanism, this Jim, is continuing to hold these investigations, carry out these investigations in order to hold the perpetrators accountable. And, you know, it's important that the regime, certainly Daesh, but in this case, the Syrian regime is held accountable for the actions it's taking against its own people. Please. Yeah.
Questions.
Sure.
Was it not a significant lacuna to have not gone after precursor chemicals or non-declared chemical weapons?
I mean, look, I really would let somebody, you know, who's far more expert in how to identify and go after precursor, as you said, chemicals that can be used or transformed into chemical weapons and used on the battlefield to speak to that. You know, someone with the OPCW could probably answer that far better than I could. All I can say is that this was a pretty comprehensive effort that successfully eliminated, as I said, some 1,200 tons of chemical weapons and took them off of the battlefield. Was it complete? No, and we've recognized that. But it was still a pretty effective operation.
And why would it not have been a better course for the president to have proceeded with what were at the time his plans to enforce the red line that he had set? Why would that not have been a better way of deterring the Assad government from using the chemical weapons that it had, and potentially from using the chlorine or other kinds of things that could be weaponized, as it were? Why wouldn't deterrence have been better served that way?
Well, and we've talked about this obviously a lot over the past couple of years, but just a couple of points to make. One is that, you know, we weren't able to get congressional approval for that authorization of force. And even if we had, it is arguable that the action that we undertook with Russia's assistance in this case was far more effective in actually removing these kind of chemical weapons, as I said, from the battlefield, that any kind of airstrikes would have been limited in the effect that they would have had on destroying these stockpiles of chemical weapons. And, sorry,
It's about deterrence.
Talking about deterrence, yeah.
Deterring
Yeah.
the Assad government from doing what you say it has done, which is not just use chemical weapons in that, but also use chlorine and other things not technically defined
Yeah.
as chemical weapons, but still highly deadly.
well, again, I think that, you know, one of the things we're going to continue to pursue through the UN, through mechanisms such as the GIM, is accountability. And we're trying to work with these mechanisms to ensure that the regime is not going to get off scot-free, is not going to be able to carry out these kinds of attacks on innocent civilians and simply walk away. There needs to be accountability in this case. We need to shine a light on these actions.
But there hasn't been any accountability since 2013, and in your own statements for weeks and weeks and months now, they continue to attack civilians, albeit with conventional weapons for the most part. And if anything, one could argue that the government is stronger now than it was 3 years ago, its grip on power. So I understand the importance of shining a light on things, but I don't see how you can argue that anybody has been held to account here, nor and therefore I don't understand why that's your argument, sort of justifying the
Right.
this
Well,
path.
I mean, look, this has been a long process. Perhaps not as swift as some would like, but that does not mean that it's still not a process that we're going to continue to work at and fulfill going forward. In terms of deterrence and in terms of the fact that they continue to carry out these kinds of attacks on civilian populations, it's a fair point to say that they're capable of using conventional weapons to also carry out atrocities in Syria, certainly in and around Aleppo, what we've seen in the past weeks and months. With regard to the use of force, we've been over this ground many, many times. There's a number of factors that we weigh when looking at the use of force, and certainly in this case, we felt it was more effective and more prudent to pursue this action to remove and destroy their declared chemical weapons. And we continue to believe that the best way forward is to pursue a political and diplomatic resolution to the conflict in Syria. Ultimately, any escalation of violence in Syria could have even more consequences for the people of Syria on the ground. And that's all the kinds of things that all the factors that we're weighing when we look at these decisions.
Can I follow up?
Yes, sir. Say.
Chlorine is available, is commercially available. There is no ban or restriction on the import or export of chlorine, as far as you know. Is it?
Said, I'm not
And
certain if, in terms of, I just don't know the specifics legally of like the quantity or the type of chlorine, so I can't answer that.
Second, how do you sort of determine the veracity of these allegations? How can you say that this has really happened or did not happen? What kind of measures or criteria you use to determine the veracity of these allegations?
Well, I mean, I think it's partly the reason why we look to these kinds of mechanisms, as I said, that are not affiliated with any country or any government, that are apolitical, if you will, that are able to carry out these investigations, look at the facts on the ground as much as they can be assessed, and reach a conclusion. You saw, as Matt noted yesterday, that the Russian representative raised questions about the validity of the findings. We obviously consider them to be valid.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of
Sure.
other things on Syria. Today, I think...
Sorry, just to,
Jason?
no, I'm sorry, but I didn't say enough about, but they did, just to speak to the work, which I think may have been what you were getting at. I mean, it was an independent investigation. They conducted hundreds of interviews, poured over thousands of documents, and analyzed a lot of forensic evidence to reach these conclusions.
Okay, can I follow up on,
Of course.
on Syria? Today, I think it was Jaish al-Fatah and another group, they said that they had begun a battle for the liberation of Aleppo or to break the siege and so on. And I wonder if you have any comment on that. Will the United States or its allies give assistance to these groups in trying to break the siege?
Well, I think we don't talk about who we give assistance to within the moderate Syrian opposition. We've seen those reports too. You're talking about that they've launched a counteroffensive in Aleppo. I don't have much detail to provide at this point. We've just seen the reports of this counteroffensive or this announcement. If I could make one observation, it's one we make frequently, which is, the fight for Aleppo is not over. And it's easy, I think, to underestimate the ease at which one can take the city of Aleppo. And it just shows, not to sound like a broken record, that you get into a cycle of escalation here that's difficult to extricate oneself from.
Okay. And lastly, today, I think a spokesman for the Russian army said that they called on President Putin to renew airstrikes, and because they claimed that there's been a cessation in attacks since for about 8 days now.
I mean, look, I mean, of course, any pause in the attacks that have been carried out on Aleppo in the past months now is a good thing for the people of Aleppo. We hope to see that continue, but we also want to see access for humanitarian assistance, which is absolutely critical to the people who've been under constant barrage now. So certainly a reduction or a pause in the violence is a good thing, but we have not yet seen humanitarian assistance be provided.
Was there a call between Secretary Kerry and the Foreign Minister of Russia today, Lavrov?
There was, yes.
There was? Okay.
Yeah, they spoke earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
Again, about this multilateral effort that's taking place in Geneva. I think Kirby said the other day, which is still kind of where we're at, we're still looking to overcome some of the differences of opinion that we have. Still working in a multilateral context on this, but still think it's worth pursuing.
Okay.
Any plans for the two of them to meet?
Nothing right now to announce, no.
Can I just ask you
Please, yeah.
briefly?
Of course.
There was another report this morning of a close call between U.S. and Russian military planes in the area, and I am just wondering how much of a concern that remains, particularly since you guys say that you suspended the bilateral contacts. I know that the deconfliction still is supposed to be going on, but it seems to me that if it was still functioning the way it's supposed to function, that you wouldn't have these kind of close calls.
So this was, as you said, a close call. I think within a half mile, 2 aircraft, which is a close call, considered a close call. I don't have a lot more details to provide other than that, but I do know that the deconfliction mechanism, I believe, was used in this case. Would refer to the DoD, but it shows, obviously we need to keep this mechanism going. And please, no, I just.
Okay, so you regard this as a success of the deconfliction?
I wouldn't say it's a
rather
success
than
because,
a failure.
I mean, it was a close call. It shouldn't have happened. That said, it underscores the importance of keeping these kinds of lines of communications going forward because, we don't want any accidents to happen.